Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, I've been studying biology and thinking about viruses lately. Anyway, my name is Clark Kent. This is my friend over here. I'm in disguise, as you can tell, and my friend is Henry. And basically, my real identity is Anterior Ventralman. You're going to see why, because I'm an illustrated man. I've got stuff illustrated on me. I'm not going to strip down totally naked, so don't worry about that. I'm going to explain my real identity as we go with this videotape. And this video is about three things. Number one, anatomical and physiological directional terms. So I'm going to discuss those first. As far as the directional terms, I want you to note that in anatomy and physiology, the anatomical position is when one is standing up on the feet. The feet are about shoulder wide. The human has the eyes open and looking straight ahead. The person's arms are slightly away from the body. The palms of the hands are facing forward with the fingers slightly apart. In this pose, if you're looking at the human from the back, the human would be balanced on the toes to partially reveal the soles of the feet. Please also note that all directional terms in healthcare are from the perspective of the patient. That's me in this case. So when I raise my left hand, it's on the viewer's right side and vice versa. A, deep or internal means away from the surface of the body or toward the inside of the body. An example is the heart is deep to the skin. B, superficial or external is the opposite of internal, so it would be in the direction of or on the surface of the body. For example, the skin is superficial to the heart. C, distal means further away from the beginning of the body or the point of attachment of a limb to the trunk of the body. For example, the wrist is distal to the biceps brachii. Here's a hint. You may think of distal as being more distant to the attachment, which in this case is the shoulder. And I have arrows showing proximal and distal. So again, the wrist is distal to the shoulder. The next is proximal. That's the opposite of distal, so proximal is closer to the origin of the body part or the point of attachment of a limb to the body trunk. For example, the biceps brachii are proximal to the wrist. E, intermediate is between a more lateral and a more medial part. Note that lateral means away from the longitudinal or this up and down midline. Also note that the medial means in the direction of the midline. An example is the nipple is intermediate between the shoulders and the sternum. F, lateral means outside the midline here. For example, the arms are lateral to the lungs. They're outside. G, medial is the opposite of lateral. So medial is in the direction of the longitudinal plane. For example, the lungs are medial to the arms. H, posterior or dorsal is toward the back side or behind the body, as you can see, or in the direction of the back of the body. For example, the lungs are dorsal or posterior to the sternum. I, anterior or ventral, if you can see the words, is the opposite of posterior. So these terms mean toward the front side of the body or in the direction of the front of the body. For example, the sternum is anterior or ventral to the lungs. J, caudal or inferior is in the direction of the lower body part or below the top end of the body or the head. For example, the foot is caudal or inferior to the nose. J, cranial or superior is the opposite of caudal or inferior, so cranial or superior means in the direction of the head or above another body part. For example, the nose is superior to the foot. Number two, sections and body planes. This section was written by my partner Getnet. The body is three-dimensional, so in order to observe its internal parts, it often helps to make use of a section or cut made along an imaginary line or line called imaginary surface, or line called a plane. There are three planes of space or sections that lie at right angles to one another. A, sagittal plane, a plane that runs lengthwise or longitudinally down the length of the body, dividing into right and left parts, is a sagittal plane. If it divides the body into equal parts, right down the medial line of the body, it's called a median or mid-sagittal plane. B, frontal plane, if you can see the lines, a longitudinal plane that divides the body or organ into anterior and posterior parts. Transverse plane if you can see the line, that's a plane that runs horizontally, dividing the body into superior and inferior parts. These sections are commonly known as cross sections. Section 3, allowed movements of synovial joints. First, what's a joint? An articulation or joint is a place where two or more bones come together. A synovial joint is a type of joint in which the bone intersection has a fluid-filled joint cavity. Let's go through some movements we can do using synovial joints. One is opposition. Opposition is done by saddle joints. There's a saddle joint between the carpal and the metacarpal bones in each thumb, called a carpometacarpal joint. For example, the opposing thumb can touch the fingertips of the other four fingers of the same hand, just like this. 2 and 3, depression and elevation. Here's a side view. An example of depression is opening the mouth by lowering the mandible or bottom jawbone, like so when I open my mouth. An example of elevation is lifting the scapula at the shoulder. I'm shrugging my right shoulder like this when I shrug the right shoulder. 3, retraction. Here's another side view. Retraction is done when the mandible is pulled in. Here's a right side view of retraction. Protraction is done when the bone, like the mandible, is projected. Here's a right side view of protraction. Now, I'll go back to show, lie back to show eversion and inversion. Eversion is when the soles are outward, like so. Inversion is when the soles are inward, like so with the ankle joints. Plantar and dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is done by pointing the toes. Notice the word plant and plantar. You can think you're planting your toes like this. Dorsiflexion, this is done by pulling the toes in and sticking the heels out at the same time, flexing both sides of the heel. Supination and pronation. In supination, the forearm is twisted up, so the palm is up like this. Here's a hint. Notice the word up in supination. Pronation is the opposite of supination. In pronation, the forearm is twisted so the palm is facing down. 10 and 11, I'll get off the table now, is lateral rotation. Strike that, medial and lateral rotation. In medial rotation, the joint rotates toward the longitudinal line, so when I turn my head from the left to the medial line, that is that type of medial rotation. Lateral rotation, it's the opposite. So the joint rotates from the medial line toward the left and or right side, like so. In circumduction, you're moving a limb so that you're making a cone shape, either way. So if you make a circle with your arm like this, you're circumducting. 13 and 14, adduction and abduction. In adduction, you're taking a limb inward. So adduction looks like this. Abduction is the opposite. In abduction, you're taking a limb outward like this. Hint, you probably know people like me who've been abducted by Martians. This means that the Martians took me away from Earth in their vessel. 15 and 16, flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Flexion deals with a body movement, usually along the line of the sagittal plane, that decreases the angle of the joint and brings two or more bones of the same joint closer together. An example is bending the head forward with the neck joint like this. Extension deals with movement along the sagittal plane that increases the angle between the bones intersecting at that joint and often straightens a bent or flexed limb or body part. An example is pulling my head back so that the face is forward like so in the anatomical position. Hyperextension deals with extending the head or other joint past the anatomical pose. An example is pulling my head back further so that the face is up like so. Gliding happens when one flat or almost flat bone slips or glides over another, side to side, back and forth, without much turning or degree of increase in the ankle. This is an example. If I raise my right hand, go sideways with the straight wrist back and forth from left to right. Thank you very much, and special thanks to Karen, Getnet, Cindy, Jasmine, and Adriana. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.